Bluebeard took the dissembled bodies and he burned them to ashes inside a 1914 Victorian cast iron stove. The smell inside his small French apartment was overwhelming, but no one made any complaints. Bluebeard disposed of the remains and they were never found again. If you have ever taken a literature arts class in college, you may have heard of the folklore Bluebeard, which was a story about a wealthy, rich nobleman who lived in a very large castle with his wife in the countryside of France. As the story goes, Bluebeard, the wealthy nobleman, needs to leave town. He leaves his keys with his wife and explains that the keys will open every door in the castle, but you must not open the one in the basement. While Bluebeard is gone, the wife gets curious and uses the key to the room in the basement where she finds the bodies of the former wives of Bluebeard. Days later, Bluebeard returns and he discovers his wife has disobeyed his request. He attacks his wife and he throws the final blow, but before he could, her sister appears to save her life. But in 1919 Paris, France, there's a story of the Bluebeard comes to life. A tall, bald man with a long beard is on trial for the murder of 10 women who were engaged to marry him. Henri Landru was a furniture salesman in Paris, France, and at a young age, Henri had a sexual relation with his cousin, which resulted in 4 children. Henri was working for a furniture dealer when his employer swindled him for cash, leaving him desperate to find financial support for him and his family. Landru then began to prey on the elderly customers and committing fraud. Henri quickly became hooked on the thrill of a new venture, collecting extra cash from unsuspected elderly folk. Landru even begins to invent things, and he sees an opportunity to get investors to part way with large amounts of cash for promises which he'll never fulfill. One example was the invention of the Landru, which was a motorcycle he designed and pitched the idea to several investors, asking for enough francs to open a factory for manufacturing. After pocketing the money, Henri vanished. Finally, police did catch up to Henri, where he was arrested and sentenced to 2 years in prison. Before Henri was released, his wife/cousin has taken the 4 kids and left. Landru tries to find work after being released, but finds it difficult to stay employed. He decides to return back to life of crime, but this time he figures his chances of getting caught would be far less if there was no victims. That's where he gets the idea to use lonely ads to find a widower that no one will miss. Although this doesn't seem like the idea that would work, World War I had just ended recently and the newspapers were full of widowers who had lost their husbands. Lonely ads were like Tinder profiles but in the newspaper and no photos. They would read similar to this: widower, age 59, no children, husband lost at war, looking for companion to remarry. My address is, and normally you would reply back with a letter, which is what Henri did. And he would look for wealthy widowers to sweet talk them into engagement. And once he had gained access to their finances, he would then murder them and move on to the next person. It's even suggested that Henri may have been with multiple women at the same time. In fact, the only reason Henri was caught is because of the widower's sister came looking for her and she was nowhere to be found. The police only had enough evidence to arrest Henri for embezzlement, and while investigating, they did discover a black book with 200 names in it. They were unable to trace most of the names, but they did find 10 widowers from Paris that they have vanished over the years. With little details, Henri kept the names of victims and his aliases, names, and dates that they met. Between 1914 and 1919, it suggested Landru murdered over 218 women, but the police only had enough evidence to present on trial 10 women and 1 teenage child. Through investigation, they were able to find financial reports connecting Henri to these women, love letters in his apartment, and documents using some aliases that was written in the little black book. 2 years has passed, and in 1921, Henri Landru is on trial for the murder of 10 women and 1 teenage boy who was the son of one of the widowers. During the trial, the prosecutors present evidence against Landru connecting the women to him and their disappearances. The defense had very little to say. The courthouse is filled with French celebrities, artists, musicians, and anyone who was famous in French culture. This was the Johnny versus Amber case of its day. People were glued to the newspaper waiting to see what would develop. Throughout the entire case, the prosecutors were missing one key element: to close the case and let the jury decide Mr. Landru's fate. That was, they had no bodies from any of the 10 women missing. There was no smoking gun. It wasn't until a young lawyer decides to do one thing no one has done the entire trial. He stands before the judge and Landru, and he asks, where are the bodies of these women? Henri, who has said little to nothing the entire trial, grabs a pen and a paper and he begins to scribble. After a few minutes, he hands the paper to the young lawyer and shows him a sketch of a 1914 French Victorian cast iron oven that resembles the exact one found in the kitchen in his small one-bedroom Paris apartment. The jury doesn't take long to return with a guilty verdict. Henri is sentenced to death by guillotine. On the day of his execution, people crowd around to witness the beheading of Bluebeard. The horror of Bluebeard is over, or are they? Stay tuned for part 2.